Hello everybody and welcome along to a brand new video today where I'm continuing the classic Doctor Who reviews, going back once again to the Second Doctor as I continue my marathon, and we reach one of the, I think, the all-time classic episodes of Doctor Who, one that's massively highly rated and is always, and since it was just rediscovered in 1991 as being one of the most popular Doctor Who stories. It's The Tomb of the Cybermen. So yes, this wonderful 1967 Cyberman story, the opening story to season 5 of Doctor Who. Somehow I've already made it to season 5, which is pretty crazy. And this story I've always loved since I watched it for the first time, I don't know, 8-10 years ago or something like that, probably even on VHS possibly. Having been discovered around, well, nearly 30 years ago now, which is pretty crazy. That 1991 was nearly 30 years is a bit mental. But yes, and this story just kind of, I think, is one of the best outings for the Cybermen. It's a great, intriguing story. It's a very good sort of story. Of course, there's an element of it kind of being a base under siege story to a degree, but it's more about a kind of archaeological dig and kind of pulling out ideas from sort of mythology, Egyptian mythology, and kind of the idea of digging down underground, trying to find the tomb of the Cybermen, obviously the tombs of the Cybermen, and trying to discover these long-lost Cybermen that obviously a couple of crazy people want to try and rule the world with, and it's never going to work. So it's just a sort of a nice idea playing on the idea of an archaeological dig and archaeological exploration, and the idea of tombs and the sort of mythology of what's hidden away inside the tombs and things like that. And it just sort of sets up the story really, really well, I think. I think the Cybermen are good in this story. I mean, to a degree, they don't do a huge amount. They don't really kill many people. The Cyber Controller is the main guy who kind of gets stuck in a little bit and sort of is at least involved in killing a couple of people. And it's great to see a Cyber Controller. This is sort of the first time that we get a kind of more leading, more important Cyberman than the rest of them, whereas in the Moon Base and in 10th Planet, they've all very much been on the sort of same level. And so to kind of heighten that now and give them this Cyber Controller, the leader that's going to lead them into this new age out of these tombs they've been trapped in for hundreds of years, I think 500 years, is a really good idea, sort of developing the Cybermen as a race, to a degree, a race of sorts. And of course the tomb scenes are extremely iconic in Doctor Who. I think even reasonably casual Doctor Who fans are likely to have seen at least a picture, if not a sort of the visual shot of the Cybermen breaking out of the tombs, that sort of at the end of episode 2, before the leading up to the cliffhanger of that episode. It's just, I think, one of the most iconic Doctor Who scenes there is across the whole 55 years of the show. That scene you just recognise it straight away, and you know that's Tomb of the Cybermen. That's the classic Cybermen sort of shot of them breaking out of their tombs, they've come out of their sleep and they're ready to invade or take over or whatever. And so it's just such a well-realised scene, I think, as well, along with the music, which is fantastic. For me, probably one of my favourite pieces of music from the classic series, because generally, classic Doctor Who, the music, not that it's not important, but it's not necessarily as memorable. It's a lot more kind of just often quite quirky and strange and just weird sort of sound effects, kind of mixture of music and sound effects. And a lot of it just not having music at all. I mean, Dudley Simpson is obviously the main guy for crazy classic Who music. But this piece of music not composed by Dudley Simpson ultimately. He's not really involved in this episode, I don't believe, but the music, I think it's called Space Adventures Part 2, so a bit of almost stock sci-fi music to a degree, but has become synonymous with this particular scene and with the Cybermen. It's almost their unofficial sort of 1960s Doctor Who sort of Cyberman theme, I think, and it just fits the scene perfectly, and really builds up the menace of the Cybermen as they come out of these spectacular looking tombs. They really have put a decent amount of money in it. Yes, it's only a blooming cling film or something over the front of the tombs, but it still looks effective, and the Cybermen themselves look effective, and it really is ominous seeing them all climbing down and coming together as one, and they open this sort of container almost and revealing the Cyber Controller at the end of the episode and him coming up to camera and saying, "You will become like us." It's just a sort of haunting moment, really, of this of these Cybermen have been unleashed again, this deadly race of former humans that have been upgraded and are ready to take over the Earth or the universe and upgrade the world. And they've been trapped away for so long, and some crazy people have just unleashed them on the world again. And it's yes, I think just such a sort of haunting and visually kind of stunning scene to end episode 2, and definitely the highlight of the 4-part story. Looking at the story more generally, you've got the sort of classic Doctor Who storyline of a couple of crazy people who want to take over the world and rule the world, and I think that the Cybermen are going to help them in ruling the world. And being sort of, not being racist, but being foreigners as well, it kind of, I think, just adds that extra little bit when they've got that sort of foreign accent to it, and it just creates them as more of a probably stereotypical but sort of mad power hungry villain. I mean, you do kind of feel like Klieg should have realised by the end of episode 4 that the Cybermen really aren't going to help you, mate. The amount of times you've unleashed them, you've let them out, you've tried to help them, and then they just go boom and slap you in the face essentially. And he still believes at the end of episode 4 that he's going to gain that power back, because he is just completely barking mad and desperate for power. And so that's quite effective, but also feels a little bit ludicrous towards the end of the story, I think, when it's just so clear the Cybermen aren't going to help. But he's just so fixed in his sort of power-hungry ways and is kidding himself into thinking that they are going to help him take over the world and everything, and it's obviously never going to happen. But it creates some nice dynamics throughout the story. And I think it's quite nice once again seeing a sort of multinational kind of crew in this story. The people who've gone on the expedition, we've got lots of different sort of nationalities spread through it, and the idea that we've seen in both the 10th Planet and the Moon Base of the idea of futuristic kind of space exploration and things like that are going to be very much a multinational affair. It's not just going to be a load of English people doing it, like I think it would, certainly in that sort of time, would maybe be the stereotypical sort of view that it was all about just British people. We're British, it's going to be the British people doing it. So the idea, almost quite forward thinking, of having that very multinational cast, which just kind of, I think, almost gives a bit more scale to the story, and just gives a few sort of different perspectives and makes it feel more, I think, more futuristic at the time than it sort of maybe would have been if they just kept them all sort of British. Even now it doesn't feel that dated, I think, in that regard, because it is accurate to what we'll probably see in the future. So I think that was a really, really good aspect to it, with several well-developed characters. Obviously the two Klieg, and I can't remember the woman's name, but those two kind of working together to try and, along with Toberman, good old Toberman, trying to take over the world essentially. Of course, Toberman, yes, he's a fairly bad racial stereotype that you massively couldn't get away with nowadays, but that just is showing where this episode is of its time in that sort of racial stereotype. And there are several stories with that kind of, unfortunately, that kind of black man is just the big bulk heavy man who sort of is a bit stupid but is got all the brute force and everything. And yes, it's a racial stereotype, unfortunately, but I don't think in this particular story it massively takes away from it. And obviously he has his moment of glory at the end of the episode as well, when he's the one who sort of says, I'm gonna hold those doors shut, which will defeat the cyber controller. And so he does still kind of get a victorious ending. Obviously he dies at the end, but kind of gets that glorious ending rather than just sort of going out with a whimper like he could have done. I think maybe if I was going to give a bit of criticism to this story, is that it maybe takes a little bit of a long time to get the Cybermen involved, particularly in the story, because we get a brief shot of a sort of dummy Cyberman at the end of episode 1, and then it's not really until the end of episode 2, already halfway through the story, that we actually get the Cybermen coming out of their tombs and kind of becoming a proper part of this story. So I think maybe if we just seen a little bit more of the Cybermen, a little bit more of them kind of as a big force spread around, but I think that's just essentially the nature of this story, is that it's not meant to be a kind of invasion story in the same way. They're not trying to take over the world or anything, so they're not going to be on the streets like we see in the invasion in a coming story, where they very much are out on the streets trying to take over the Earth. But this is more about them just kind of coming back from the dead and then finding a way to survive and build and conquer from there. So I can kind of understand that, but maybe it would have been nicer to see the Cybermen a little bit earlier on. It's nice that they give a sort of reference to the previous two Cybermen stories, when the Cyber Controller and the Doctor meet for the first time, and the Cyber Controller sort of mentioning how the Doctor blew up their home planet Mondas and then defeated them when they were trying to take over the moon base as well, and just kind of bringing in that bit of continuity and referencing back to the fact they recognise the Doctor, they know who he is because he's defeated them twice in the past and they want to get their revenge now. And then the idea behind their original plan of setting up these sort of difficult traps and a difficult way to find the Cybermen, which means that only somebody who's intelligent enough will actually be able to find them and unlock them, and then they'll be able to use that power and sort of upgrade these people who already got great brains and great minds to be great Cybermen in the future, is their idea. And so I think that's quite clever that they're not just, they kind of locking away for a purpose in that regard. They're being locked away, but they've really got a plan of how they want to come out, so they've got the right people to use when they do escape eventually, because they know it would happen because of sort of human curiosity or human sort of greed in that regard, wanting to find these Cybermen to try and use them, which was never going to work. And yes, overall, it's just a story that really skips through. It's got iconic Cybermen moments. The Doctor maybe, he's reasonably involved in this story. He's sort of coming up with all the solutions, and I think this is a very kind of Patrick Troughton second Doctor story. It just has all the kind of aspects, I think, of a Patrick Troughton story, and I think he plays the role really well again as well. There's a few nice moments with Victoria when he has that little sort of conversation about how he sort of he remembers his family when he wants to. He sort of has to try really hard, but then he can remember them, and the rest of the time they're just dormant and sleeping. And I think that's a really kind of almost a nice idea for anybody who'd sort of lost a family member or something like that, is that you need to focus on other things and move forward and everything like that. And there'll be too many other things to kind of think about that person you've lost all the time. And that just when you try really hard, you can sort of bring them back again and think about them again, but you don't need to sort of be dragged down by that all the time. So that was just a really, really nice moment between the Doctor and Victoria. Of course, quite an iconic scene, and then saying about how no one else can do what we do and everything like that. It's fairly famous, but I think it is such an effective scene, and a really just a nice sort of heartwarming scene between the Doctor and Victoria, when Victoria's very much being kind of scooped up with the Doctor and Jamie after being sort of left on her own after her father died at the end of the Evil of the Daleks, and suddenly she's been thrusted in front of Cybermen and everything, and it's like all a bit crazy for her. And so it's nice, I think it's at the end of, near the end of episode 3, for them to finally be able to just sit down and have a little sort of chat, and kind of sort of her to be really encouraged so it's just, I think, a really, really nice scene, and just proceeds to top off what's a really strong episode as a whole, and leaving it on a nice kind of mini cliffhanger of seeing that Cybermat that's starting to escape off to create some new breed of Cybermen for a future episode or something like that. I've never seen The Wheel in Space, the next Cybermen story, so I'm looking forward to seeing how that all plays out. And then we move on to the invasion, and then Revenge of the Cybermen all the way in 1975. Goodness me, there's a long way to go before I get to that one. But yes, The Tomb of the Cybermen is a fantastic story. But I'd love to hear from you guys. What do you think of The Tomb of the Cybermen? Do you think it is one of the best, one of the most iconic Cybermen stories? Do you think it's a little bit overrated? I know there is a few people who think that actually it's not as great as everybody raves about. And if you do, let me know why down in the comments below. I'd love to hear that. Or if you love this story, I'd love to hear as well. But other than that, guys, do remember to hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you again very soon for another one. Goodbye.